Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Salam and welcome to everyone on this 11th of February. We've had quite a day here at the Tabadlab. We organized the forum on federalism with a view to try and engage the imagination and the conversation around issues of how power is shared, how power is exercised, and how that's evolved, particularly in Pakistan. But we're closing the day today, I think, with a really fantastic panel of experts that are from around the world. We're lucky to have Rupak Chattopadhyay, who is the head of the Forum for Federations. We're lucky to have Catherine Adeney. She's a scholar, a university professor, and she's examined and studied Pakistani federalism, and particularly the 18th Amendment in recent years. And at least friends of mine that have known me for a little while know that I don't bother with much of an introduction for Pratap Banu Mehta, except to say that South Asia and the world's lucky to have public intellectuals of his caliber. He is now at Ashoka University, and I'm really happy that all three of you were able to make time and have this conversation with us. Before we were starting, I had a colleague come up to me and tell me that please make sure you don't start a debate about federalism versus unitary states, because the theme is centralization of power versus devolution. I'm really grateful to Danial. Danial Adam Khan is a colleague of mine. He's curated this entire effort, not just him, but actually I do want to take a couple of seconds to acknowledge the team that's worked on this. We're trying to do this, remotely, which is not easy. There's so many time differences. We, I think, principally are grateful to people who've made the time to be with us. Catherine, I know you've been watching and engaging during the rest of the sessions as well. But it's not an easy time for the world either. For somebody who's a noted public intellectual from India to be on our platform is a privilege, and I think an important signal that we can have serious conversations no matter what the wider political economy is. Rupak, of course, is really kind of in many ways the godfather of federalism, and I mean that in a very in a very good way, given his vast experience in government and now in trying to understand how federal states and structures work and how they're evolving. So thanks to all of you, but a special thanks, as I said, to Danial Adam Khan, Zinia Rasool, Sidra Raza, Raya Akram, Amber Rahim Shamsi. I'm definitely going to forget some of my colleagues' names, but I'll keep going. Asad Rafi, Minahil Gilani, Shahab Siddiqui. The whole Tabadlab team has worked really hard to put this together. This is the 5th session of the day. We actually had a casualty. We had to cancel one session because of technical difficulties. But really, really delighted that we're ending the day like this. And I want to start the conversation, Rupak, with you, because I think you can help frame stuff for us. My own view has been that the Tony Blair era in the UK was a really vital one. And it was a really toxic and poisonous one as far as the idea of devolved power and agency for devolved centers of power. Because perhaps in a way that was unprecedented, he centralized power in the executive office of the prime minister. And ironically, or not, it worked. And I think the signal that sent was that the cabinet and the parliament, be they as they may be, are not as vital as we had previously thought. And that if you consolidate and centralize power in executive office, and there's so many examples of that. My favorite, of course, is Michael Barber, who came out of that sort of laboratory of executive agency that consolidated around Blair. And now, of course, we have much more, in many ways, from a freedom and democracy perspective, insidious examples of centralization of power. The Russian leadership is one good example. I think a lot of Western, of course, in Pakistan, we're not as afraid of the Chinese and not as critical of them either. But certainly, I think President Xi and his model. So all over the world, you see a lot of people that are responsible for governing big places, big countries. They're seeing strong men and people who are benefiting from the centralization of executive authority and the exercise of central fiat. How damaging is that for those that argue that decentralized systems are better? And more broadly, how damaging is that for the project of federalism? Rupa?
Okay, that's a very complex question to unpack. Let me start by saying that the centralization of power, in my experience over the last 20 years or so or more, is not limited just to the Xi's and the Putins. You will see that in other parts of the world as well, including where I am in Canada, where cabinet ministers really don't count for much because the locus of decision making has moved to a centralized agency, usually a prime minister's office or a cabinet office. But you see this in other places in Europe as well. I mean, in the context of devolved governing or federal governance, it's a matter of perspective on how damaging this is. Because one of the things that one tends to see, particularly now that this is we see this more in the context of COVID decision making. In fact, I'm just editing a book looking at 24 countries, 24 federal and devolved countries, and the process by which COVID mitigation policies have been made. We see actually that almost all decision making is at the executive level. What distinguishes, say, the Chinas and the Russias of the world from the Canada, the Germanys of the world, is that you have interaction between subnational and national executives. But the locus of decision making is definitely executive rather than parliamentary or diffused at each level. So I don't know if that answers your question. Now, in terms of whether it is damaging to a process of decentralized decision making, at one level, perhaps yes, because one doesn't one doesn't consult more widely, doesn't necessarily get one's message out in a way that that one should. I mean, Pratap can talk more about the context in which he's operating, I'm sure. But it's just a different way of governing, and where you have federal systems where you cannot bypass states and provinces, you have no choice but to work with them. So yes, it's a different complexion. That's I'll leave it here. Maybe we can return to this theme.
Yeah, I'd like to, and maybe take it to Pratap. Pratap, we've seen, I think, I think Western analysis and sort of an anglicized, analytical culture makes Xi and Putin sort of easy. In gaming, we call them free frags, right? They're right there. They're easy to criticize. We don't know their language. They don't speak ours, and so we get away with it. Brazil, India, Pakistan, lots of federal systems where the federal system that was predicated on decentralized executive agency have not been able to resist the allure of the strongman. So is there, I guess the question I have is, and obviously I hope that Catherine and Rupak will address this later as well, but for you, Pratap, is there something about technology that is driving all of this, or is this an evolution in how people engage with the state? Because the other thing that's happening concurrent to all this is that state behavior in terms of effectiveness leaves a lot to be desired. So on the one hand, you have this increasing centralization. On the other hand, the stuff that's supposed to work isn't working as well. These are two different vectors. How do you see all of this?
First of all, thanks for having me. I think I want to distinguish kind of three components of your question, which is I do think we need to think about centralization and the conditions that have led to the rise of executive power in a much wider historical perspective. Because as Rupak said, it has happened in all jurisdictions, happened over time. Actually, if you believe Pierre Roosevelt, that has been an inherent kind of drive in democracy towards the centralization of executive power. Even the US, which we thought had more checks and balances, right? Turned out you can do amazing things with executive power. And I think there are three long-term drivers which are, I think, independent of whether there are strong men or not. I mean, frankly, even relatively weak executives have been able to use these drivers. So, and these are benign drivers, right? I mean, these are for good reasons. So one is, I think, the proliferation of rights-based approaches to social policy. So for example, if you think of India, right? If you think of health, education being the domain of the state, the more you articulate social policy in terms of rights, the more likely it is you'll get centralization, right? Because now you have to make these available to everybody and the central government is responsible, the courts will enforce them. The second big driver, I think, is the modern regulatory state and the imperatives of regulatory harmonization, right? So in India, one of the biggest centralizing forces, for example, has been this new tax, the GST, right? Now, we can argue about its desirability or not, but the more you harmonize regulatory standards, right, the more centralization you will get. And one of the things we know from the American literature is that the biggest source of executive power is actually the complexity of administrative law. I mean, it's truly astonishing, actually, how much executive power lies within the interstices of administrative law. And the third, of course, is national security issues, which traditionally, in a sense, has often led to state centralizing. So I think those tendencies are actually pretty pronounced across the world, in some ways. Now, the strongman issue, which in a sense you raised, obviously the actual practice of federalism is not just a function of formal rules or administrative culture. It is a consequence of the distribution of social power, right? The more fragmented actual social power is between regions, groups, castes, classes, the more decentralization you will get. And the question is, why has that fragmentation of social power in some senses diminished, which is what allows strong men, in a sense, or centralized parties to, in a sense, emerge, right? And there, I think you do have a point, which is that in particularly India, I think it's something, I mean, there are lots of sociological complexities. There has been a general disintermediation of political power, right? One of the reasons you don't need cabinet ministers anymore as powerfully is because the prime minister can talk to the entire country directly, right? Across the world. And this kind of disintermediation has certainly been made possible by new technologies. I mean, we used to think you cannot run presidential style elections in India, right? I actually think presidential style elections are going to be the norm, not the exception. You do have a prime minister now who can, what political scientists are beginning to call attribution effects, which is to say, run media campaigns and actually claim credit for frontline delivery of state schemes as well, right? So there is definitely something about this process of disintermediation, right? Which partly technology has enabled, but partly I think there's also a sociological underpinning to it, which is that what is happening to caste, class, other regional identities that are being configured in new ways to allow for larger consolidated identities to emerge. And the last and final thing I'll say on this, which is the nature of political parties. I mean, I think when we think about India, it is important to remember that it's not just Mr. Modi, the individual. The BJP is an astonishing political party in the way in which it can organize political funding, it can mobilize cadres, create a plethora of civil society organizations that are playing for the long term. So while there is new politics, there is also good old-fashioned organizing at the base of the centralization.
I think the disintermediation point is exactly, I think you've captured the framing exactly right. You've basically, through technology for me, but I think the other points you make are equally valid, but in other contexts, there isn't a BJP, and yet you still have the emergence of individual strongmen, and I hate using that term, but it really, they would certainly like that term, and so it keeps us on the right side of such executives. This disintermediation is kind of, Catherine, for Pakistan, which you've examined and studied, I think in quite a lot of depth and detail. It's kind of weird because it took us, 60 odd years to figure out federalism. And we had this watershed moment in this country in 2010. But it's almost like somebody was watching the development of Facebook and Twitter, which is around the same time, and saying, now we can let them have a federal system because actually it won't matter. And I think you're seeing evidence of some of that, not just in countries like India or or Brazil, or even I think the Trump era was in many ways astonishing in terms of what individual executive power is able to do vis-a-vis state power. How does all of this land in terms of what the conversation around centralization and devolution should evolve to? Because the key question in terms of representation and service delivery and the kind of connectivity between the state and the individual actually remains unanswered. I mean, it's fine that people get to like tweets that make them feel good, but feeling good won't solve your COVID, or won't get water to your house, or won't get your kids in a decent school. So how do we, from the disintermediation, how do we mediate between the state and the citizen, especially in a context like Pakistan's? Easy question.
Easy question, yes, and linking it nicely to technology. I wanted to say I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and it's a really important topic. I'm going to start off in the same way that Pratap did, actually, with just reminding everybody that this isn't new. Okay, so we're talking about centralization, we're talking about populism, we're talking about populist authoritarianism. But I mean, if you go and look, in the history of India, in the history of Pakistan, we've seen populist leaders before, kind of articulating, going straight to the masses. And this has happened even without, the medium of technology. So, I mean, mentioning people like, Indira Gandhi, the former Prime Minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, they all had this kind of populist agenda and this centralizing agenda. So that's really important. Although technology has maybe made it easier, it's not something that is necessarily new. Linking it to, the 18th Amendment, that was absolutely a staggering development. And I've really enjoyed some of the panels I've been able to see today that you've been running on this topic. And people who have been watching federalism in Pakistan for a while were really quite astonished that so much had managed to be agreed between the political parties. That there was unanimity on the commission report. It was a proper all-party agreement. And I think it was really, I'm not sure I'd link it so much to, kind of being allowed to do it because of social media. I think, the establishment hadn't really expected there to be that much unanimity between the political parties on changing things like the devolution of power, on changing the allocation of resources. And I think now the moves that you're seeing trying to, kind of roll back on the 18th Amendment, both in terms of powers, but also in terms of resources, is a sign that they weren't expecting politicians to be able to make these changes. The problem, of course, is that it's been written into the Constitution, and that's actually going to make it quite hard to change without being extremely destabilizing to Pakistan. I just want to raise one point, because you also started off on Tony Blair, and it's absolutely right that you had a lot of centralization under Tony Blair, power concentrated in the Prime Minister's office, communicating, to the public via the media and having one message. But Blair was also the person who introduced devolution to the United Kingdom. And it's something I'd like to talk about a bit more later if we have time, is the way in which the devolved administrations are actually leading to more effective government. And we've certainly seen that during the COVID crisis, compared to, say, the role of the central British government.
Fantastic, Catherine. I do want to come back to that. And that's, we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of just Pakistan. We've had quite a lot of conversation around that, although I am going to ask all of you to come back someday soon, and we'll do that. But Rupak, you're in Canada, and just having been born and raised in Southern Ontario, and luckily, learning French as a function of that, and learning how Albertans in particular shared the bounty of the oil and gas advantage that they had, but also seeing the evolution of Albertan politics almost in a completely different, like it's almost like it exists in a vacuum. Seeing Quebecois politics and Quebecois rhetoric, escalate and de-escalate over the years. A country like Canada, I mean, a lot of people that get into this argument in a country like Pakistan point to Canada and say, look, when you're as wealthy and you have the advantage of a 100-year head start, you can afford those kinds of narratives that are, in a sense, peripheral to whatever you might call the mainstream. What is the internal sense within a country like Canada about the experience of this kind of, maybe it's not accurate, but what I might call a laissez-faire kind of federalism? And how has that changed or caused the evolution of the debate between centralization and devolution within Canada?
So Canada is a bit of an exception when it comes to federation, because we're one of the world's most decentralized federations. And this is really a function of the fiscal system that we have, where the provinces actually raise most of their own source revenue. So they're really, in terms of their dependence on the central government or the federal government, it's really, really small. So, the provinces have the luxury of taking extreme positions on things, but there is a recognition that the provinces are better off together, because we've had separatist movements in Quebec before. People keep talking about Western alienation, but these are very small populations, and the question of whether they'd really be viable economically and otherwise in the context of a greater North America, that's questionable, and that's what forces people to step back and to realize that just because you have oil today doesn't mean that you're going to have oil tomorrow or a natural resource tomorrow that you can rely on. And if you look at the history of the Canadian system, you find that provinces today, which are have provinces, were a generation or two ago have-nots, and through history this is flipped. And so, being part of the federation, a federation that, as equitably as possible, distributes welfare, it is more attractive than striking out on your own. I just wanted, listening to Pratap and Catherine, and given the topic you started with, I just wanted to make one point. Although we see more and more a centralization of power within executives, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're seeing less federalism or less devolution or less decentralization across the world. In fact, if you were to ask me, I think that over the last 40 years even, there has been a greater move towards devolution and decentralization, including in countries which were previously very highly centralized and unitary. I mean, 25 years ago, when I taught comparative politics at university, the United Kingdom was your typical unitary centralized system. But so much has changed. Even in and I'm highlighting these two because we have experts from these two countries. Even in a country like India, where you see populism, centralized populism, the fact of the matter is, over the last 20 years, through various awards from the Fiscal Commission, you now have a situation where the central government is actually fiscally shrinking, and the states have more and more resources at their beck and call. So my limited point here.
No, thank you, Rupak. I think it's an interesting point you raise about the fiscal space in India and that dynamic. Pratap, you earlier alluded to the GST situation. Maybe I can ask you to talk a little bit more about that. How a post-GST India might be struggling with kind of its version of federalism, or causing more tension in the system than it has in the past. But I'd love to hear your answer on that, but I also want you to speak a little bit about this trend that Rupak has alluded to. To a great extent, I agree with him. There has been more devolution. I wonder if you could also talk a little bit about urbanization and human mobility as being drivers, perhaps, of that. I think the reason I combine those two is that India is a great example of a country where urbanization and human mobility has kind of really, the only other example on scale is China, in terms of how fast some cities have just popped out of, kind of ruraldom. And so is that also informing this dynamic of centralization and devolution, Pratap?
Okay, well, so just a couple of quick thoughts on that. So, one quickly on GST. So GST is a kind of paradoxical intervention at one level, because To be fair, it was done entirely with the cooperation of the states. I mean, technically, the states came together, they design it, there's a council of states. So this is one important aspect of federalism, right? It's not just the devolution, it's whether the different units can actually work together in an institutional framework, right? Although it does have the consequence that the revenue generating potential of states on their own is actually diminished. So in that sense, GST is actually a very paradoxical intervention in the history of Indian federalism. There are some issues around implementation and the complexity of GST, which again, ironically, were a result of it being a federally negotiated settlement, because, different states wanted different rates and different things. So there are those kinds of administrative issues. In the pandemic year, I think central government was trying to push the boundaries a bit in terms of, how much it would compensate the state for COVID losses and those things. But I think by and large, those issues have been resolved. And I think India's general fiscal compact is going to remain. Now, at the margins, the central government is trying to cheat. I mean, one of the things it does is it imposes cesses, which is money generated that doesn't go into the tax pool that has to be shared with states. So at the margins, 2 to 3%, it plays around with that. But by and large, I think you'll see in the Finance Commission reports that, that broad fiscal compact will remain. The urbanization migration point you made is actually really interesting because, one of the things that had begun to happen in India, as Rupert alluded to this, was, of course, devolution below the states, right? The 73rd, 74th Amendment to urban local bodies and Panchayati Raj. I think it's fair to say that devolution hasn't quite accelerated in the way that we had hoped, particularly on the 74th Amendment. None of the provinces want to let go of control of the major cities. There's a political economy to it. If you're a chief minister of state, right, Maharashtra, why would you let go control of Bombay, which is in a sense going to be the cash cow, right? And we haven't quite resolved that contradiction, I think, in that devolution story. So very few Indian cities have, empowered mayors, for example, to the extent that at least many people hoped we would have. But I think there's another thing, I think, in that devolution that I think is important. And I want to pick on a phrase you used, which was important, which was service delivery, right? So at one level, I think Rupak is right that, local governments are having to, and inevitably they will do much more of the frontline social delivery services, right? But I actually don't see the service delivery function as genuine devolution, because there's a difference between whether you see devolution as creating democracy from below, or whether you see it as a kind of administrative devolution saying local governments will do frontline delivery. By the way, the norms for that frontline delivery have been set at the center, right? And I think that's in a sense been the big tension in the devolution story, that of course frontline governments will have to deal with the story, but how comfortable are you in giving local democracy the autonomy, right, to design its own rules, to be exempt from centralized bureaucratic oversight? I think on that front, I don't think any of this devolution is actually committed to that kind of local democracy, in some ways. And I think the emphasis on service delivery captures it, because service delivery also happens to be the conduit by which then the center or the bureaucracy actually exercises more control over local elected representatives than you would in a genuine local democracy.
That opens up a real sort of can of worms. Again, it's sad that we still have a little bit of time, but I think, Rupa, go ahead, please. You got to unmute though. We got to hear you.
No, I agree with Pratap that provincial governments, state governments, not just in India but elsewhere, are loath to actually cede popular sovereignty to local governments. We are talking in the context of South Asia, but I'll give you an example. people may not be aware, but the metropolitan region of Sydney has 66 local governments. And the reason it has that is because the Premier of New South Wales doesn't want to be politically challenged by a mayor of a popularly elected mayor in Sydney. And because they've seen across the border in Queensland, where Brisbane, Northeast Queensland, the agglomeration has a popularly elected mayor who has a larger constituency with more money than many of the cabinet ministers in Queensland. So it is ultimately a political question, and politicians never want to cede power. It's just the way politics plays out. So no, I
think absolutely. I think that one of the added complexities is identity in that matrix, right? Because in Mumbai, for example, we see this with the Bal Thackeray, sort of the Shiv Sena. I think for many years we saw it with the communists in Kolkata, and in Karachi we see it with the MQM and the way that it negotiates. We just had a session earlier where folks from the MQM and the way that they engage with people who keep winning the province, who are from outside the Karachi constituency. But maybe the resistance to ceding power to, Catherine, this is for you, but again, I think we'll come back to it as well with Pratap and Rupak. Maybe part of the resistance to ceding this power at a global level is what happened to autonomous, strong mayor cities, for example, in the United States in the 70s and 80s. So the kind of Jane Jacobs kind of, retelling of the story of the rise and fall of the great American city. New York City going bankrupt is kind of now so old that it's hard for people to remember, but we've seen great American cities, rot from the inside out before our very eyes. I think a lot of what we've seen in the Black Lives Matter movement has been informed by urban decay, and that urban decay partly was informed by a massive imbalance between the fiscal capacity of urban centers and the service delivery sort of role that they had assumed because they had that autonomy. So at some level, aren't these provinces and states right to actually not give away power in these big cities? Catherine?
Yeah, so I don't think it's just an issue of giving it away to the big cities. I mean, local government obviously operates in many areas other than big cities. I mean, the problem that Pakistan has had, as some of your previous speakers on the other panels talked about, is the fact that local government has all too often in the past, whether it be Ayub Khan's basic democracies or under General Mosharraf, has been used as a way to actually undermine the provincial politicians and to go directly from the centre right down to the grassroots. And, as Pratap was talking about, kind of controlling, those organisations and controlling those politicians in a way to undermine democracy. So it's always got that problem in Pakistan. And you've seen there are more, you've seen in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, you see a bit in Punjab, moves to create a, kind of a better local government system, but it's very much dependent on provincial will and provincial government will. Now, in terms of service delivery and in terms of kind of engaging people, they can go together. If people see that services are going to be delivered efficiently at the local level, and then they may see that they have a stake in voting for that and getting in a role, or taking up a role in local democracy. But the problem is, as you see in Pakistan, but you see elsewhere as well, is that people just don't see that that's where the power lies. And if the power doesn't lie there, then people aren't going to see that it matters, turning out to vote or participating within it. Obviously, you have also very successful mayors. Rupak's talking about the Australian case. I would also mention the London case. So you can also have, mayors are not necessarily lead to urban decay. Often they may also be responding to the problems and may not have the resources to fix it properly. But I can't speak about the American case, I'm afraid.
No, but you mentioned the UK and kind of devolution to local authorities in the UK. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that, and also maybe contextualize that with respect to Scotland and what's been happening there over the past few years. Because the reason I ask is because one might argue that in this discussion so far, we've kind of skirted around. I mean, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but I feel like we're skirting around identity in all of this. That actually, you know, Albertans, you know, may not care so much about anything except that they see the fabric of society and the way that they grew up changing to the extent that makes them uncomfortable. They see stuff on TV, then they see somebody on the street corner, maybe wearing a hijab, maybe wearing, you know, a Sikh turban, and it makes them uncomfortable. And you know, this is a perhaps you know, risky topic, you know, for a lot of folks. But I think one of the reasons why these kinds of conversations have not found traction with ordinary folks is because we kind of ignore this stuff. Obviously, you know, it gets a little hotter as we move through the panel. We'll eventually talk about this. I think I'm happy to talk about Pakistan. I'd love to hear views on that, but also in India. What is the interplay between identity and the kind of positive experience of devolution in the UK vis-a-vis Scotland?
That's a really good question. And I mean, my overall research, I mean, specifically looks at identity politics, and I'd love to have an opportunity to talk about that in relation to Pakistan later if we have time. In relation to the UK, though, you had demands for Scottish autonomy, Welsh autonomy. In 1997, you see the devolution, the creation of a Scottish executive, and the creation of a Welsh assembly. There are two ways that could have gone. One way would have been to have been, you know, like an Andhra Pradesh in India, where you give autonomy, you create a state, and everything becomes compatible, you know, with the centre. There's no necessary tension between being Scottish and being British or having antagonism to London. Or it could have gone the other way, where you have a situation like Catalonia in Spain, where you see you give autonomy and then you see the advent of a lot more secessionist pressures. Now, given that Scotland's had its referendum, which, okay, it rejected independence, but it was relatively close, you might see that it's much more the Catalonia example. But what I think is quite interesting is the fact that it's not just about giving autonomy and recognizing identities within these devolved structures or within federal structures, as India did. It's also about kind of, do you feel your interests are represented at the center? And it's very striking in both India's history, Pakistan's history, the United Kingdom's history, when a unit that has autonomy, like Scotland, like Punjab in India, like Sindh in Pakistan, feels that its interests aren't being represented in the centre, that's often when you get tensions emerging.
Rupak, again, you know, you have the rare sort of, you know, privilege and expertise to kind of have a very broad overview of, you know, many countries that that exercise the model of federalism. Is there a set play that we can sort of, you know, prescribe for Pakistan and India and Canada to sort everything out? And if there isn't, what are the things that inform the unique sort of, you know, each to their own size? How do we bespoke the federalism jacket so that everyone's wearing a fit that looks good on them?
You know, let me just say that each federal system is very different, and I think is a product of its own unique history, politics, social circumstances. You know, there are some shared views about you know, constitutionally recognized orders of government, delegated powers to various levels, and a referee of some kind, you know, Supreme Court that can, when there's a conflict between the various orders of government, adjudicate that. But apart from that, you know, I mean, you can. Canada is a parliamentary federation. India is a parliamentary federation. You know, there are certain aspects of the Indian system that are inspired by Canada, but the social, political, historic realities are so different; they're incomparable. But the issue of identity is, I think, you know, very important. Certainly, in the Canadian case, it's very important. Canada is a federation because it is a diverse country. Canada was the world's first country to become a federation in order to accommodate diversity. In this case, it was Quebec. This was Ontario, and what is today Ontario and Quebec were one colony. Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and at some point, having seen what the Civil War did further south in the U.S., policymakers in this country, politicians in this country, felt that the only way they were going to create a stable, unified state was to create a federation, recognizing the francophone Catholic identity of Quebec. And this has extended over the years through various parts of the country. This is a very diverse country. Identity politics is very important in this country in a way, particularly in the last 40 years, given the size of the immigrant population, but also we have an indigenous population in this country, spread all over the country. So identity is very much at the heart of federal policy making in the federation at the provincial level, and something that will continue to shape the way in which the Canadian Federation operates.
Thanks, Rupak. I'm so curious to maybe dig a little bit deeper and ask you to maybe compare with maybe Switzerland and Brazil. I think those two in particular are fascinating. A lot of in terms of size compatibility with these other big countries that we're talking about. But before I come back to you, Rupak, just to take this to Pratap and kind of again, I kind of load up the roster with questions. So I'll try to keep this one relatively simpler, and that is, it seems to me one of the advantages of a federal system should be that it should fuse, or it should moderate at a minimum, if not neutralize, the majoritarian instincts that may emerge. In fact, one of the principal reasons you would want that in a country like Pakistan, you don't want the Punjab to decide everything for everybody, and so you essentially institute ways and means that water down the numerical strength of one group in order to advance the interests of togetherness and harmony. Pakistanis in particular have always looked at the Indian federal model. I made a joke once when somebody was showing me around Gurgaon and Noida, and I said, well, we now have Haryana state. I fully expect the next time I'm here, we'll have Noida state and Gurgaon state too, with the speed at which they were growing. And so it's always been kind of a model and an envy for Pakistanis, the kind of the manner in which, obviously with the exception of Kashmir, and that's a separate conversation. But how does the majoritarian populism that really now dominates Indian politics stack up against the expectation that a functional and effective and coherent federalism would tackle that?
Well, it's a big question. We're trying to find the answer to that one. I think two things about it, right? One, you'd asked Rupak whether there's a kind of template to this. And I think historically, I think there are clearly two conditions for any federation to succeed, right? Two, you might say negative conditions, which is one is, of course, you should not have a political system that targets people for being who they are and discriminates against them for being who they are, whether it's a religious identity, linguistic identity, or regional identity. And most federations fall apart usually if there is discrimination of that kind. And I think on that front, India historically actually did, a couple of exceptions apart, did actually quite well on the sort of accommodation of regional and linguistic diversity within that federal structure, right? The second, of course, as Catherine said, is you have to have enough share in power in the center, at least as a kind of defensive mechanism, that that the center cannot do things to you which you might not consent to, as it were, in terms of your region and identity. And again, I think historically India did well in that. I think the assumption that is being tested now, and I think this is the interesting challenge, which is, as you know, Mosharraf, I think in all our countries, there are lots of different divides around which you can construct majoritarianism, right? You can do sort of religion, you can do a core region, right? Hindi speaking versus the rest or something like that. And I think the one thing we have discovered over the course of the last election, maybe a couple of elections, is that so long as the BJP does not radically meddle with the linguistic settlement, right? There are elements within the party that want to push it in that direction, but so long as it doesn't radically meddle with the linguistic settlement, the regional federalism is not necessarily an impediment in the consolidation of Hindu majoritarian power. That cross-cutting cleavage, which we used to think was almost like a natural check, right? In some senses, region and caste against Hindu majoritarianism. I don't think we can take that politically for granted. And frankly, I think the center and left parties in India have been utterly lazy in thinking that there was something sociologically overdetermined about these cross-cutting cleavages that would prevent the rise of, in some senses, majority. But as I said, the big proviso is so long as the BJP does not radically disturb that linguistic and identity settlement. The second thing about identity, I'll say, which is, I think, a more complicated issue, I think, across all our federalisms. You alluded to the Shiv Sena, which is, India has seen extraordinary regional, extraordinary mobility. I mean, the pandemic showed us the kind of extent of migration in India, for example. And one of the interesting minor developments, I think, in Indian federalism is a lot of the debate about should there be reservations for jobs in particular states, right? I mean, so should it be an integrated labor market, is actually coming back on the agenda. I mean, the state that I live in, Haryana, Gurgaon, you mentioned, has just, proposing a law that, there be reserved jobs for Haryana locals, particularly jobs under 50,000 rupees a year. And I think the big challenge for, India in a sense is going to be that at one level, this mobility is extraordinary because it has actually nationalized politics in amazing ways. But it has renewed that question of what happens to, in a sense, local economies, the pros and cons, in a sense, of migration, right? I think in a new and, interesting way. So migration is a force for integration, and I think India has seen the benefits of it. But it will also constantly now generate these anxieties around local employment in ways that which we probably haven't seen over the last 15, 20 years.
I'm so glad you brought in this economic dimension, because that was a key theme that I had wanted us to explore a little bit. Catherine, maybe a stranger example, because again, this doesn't get captured as much in our conversations. And again, aside from the sort of monarchic model and whatever our views might be, but one of the most fascinating federal structures I find on the planet is the UAE. And the reason being, what Pratap just alluded to, which is kind of the money question. And in a sense, the imbalances between the 7 emirates essentially get covered by essentially the wallet that Abu Dhabi is able to wield and bring to bear. If I was to juxtapose that with Canada, in many ways, it is the capacity of the Canadian state to raise revenue, and particularly non-tax revenue, that allows Canada to, in a sense, buy down, emergent threats to a sense of exclusion. And if I relate that to Pakistan, just today we're hearing about, there's going to be on the western corridor of what was originally the western corridor of CPEC, the corridor of Pakistan that is less developed. I think one of the challenges for Pakistan, notwithstanding other, discontents that both legitimately and less so might exist in terms of issues with civil military and issues with domination of Karachi and Lahore, is actually the fact that this is not a country that can buy its way out of the lack of connectivity that actually ails this federation. How much of physical infrastructure connectivity and money are informing the kind of the discontents within federal systems? And again, I'd love to hear your thoughts, not just on Pakistan, but especially on the UK and the way in which Brexit and the vote for Brexit kind of panned out.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I will start with Pakistan, because I think the money question is really, really important. And I mean, if you look at states such as Baluchistan in particular, also Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, I mean, many of the grievances that those provinces have had has been that development, even in a national project such as CPEC, which was sold as being a proper national project, it was going to benefit all provinces of Pakistan, all peoples of Pakistan. But the research myself and others have done demonstrates actually it's been mainly the Punjab and Sindh that have benefited to date. So that's a real issue, and it is a real grievance. And the economic grievances go back a very long time. You talked about the centre, kind of being able to pay to kind of alleviate these provinces' woes. But in fact, a lot of money has been taken out of these provinces, especially in places like Baluchistan with its resources, and going to the centre rather than going to Baluchistan proper. So that is important. But I would come back again. It's also about representation at the centre, a feeling of belonging, a feeling that you are welcomed as a member of the federation and not just treated as, well, you're only 4% of the population, why should we bother with you? And that's been a long-standing problem, and it's not something that's just been for the last government or the government before that. Economically, I mean, the problem we had with Brexit in the United Kingdom was more the fact that people felt left behind. A lot of people did not feel as if they had a stake in the European project. Now, Scotland and Wales, or Scotland particularly, feels a lot more strongly European than a lot of England does. And that's partly because Europe has really recognised the regions and seeks to empower them. Whereas in England, we don't have a regional government. We're just part of the United Kingdom. We have a British government. And the elite in London, really misread the mood of the country. People feeling economically marginalised, left behind, and saw Europe as contributing to that.
I guess just to dig a little bit further on that, I think that issue of the London elite, I mean, it wasn't just the elite in London that voted for the EU, right? And so I guess my question was also, much as you kind of rightly pointed out, the historic grievance of what we, sitting in the big cities call the so-called periphery, the UK has a center periphery problem vis-a-vis, metropolitan London and the rest of England. In particular, that seems to be common, despite the fact that historically UK's had a lot more money to throw at the problem. So what beyond economics might be informing that similarity or that commonality?
Again, I will come back to representation and are people's interests being represented? And Scotland actually fiscally does pretty well out of the United Kingdom. But areas in the north of England, around Newcastle, traditionally have not done. In Cornwall, in the southwest of England, again, these are places that have been economically left behind because they haven't had their interests represented. Ironically, much of the development funding for these areas has actually come from the European Union. And many of the people who voted to leave felt that, they were going to be getting more money from Westminster once they had voted to leave the European Union, because the central government would then have the money to spend on them rather than going to the European Union. But unfortunately, they've been rather shortchanged. They've actually done worse out of it.
Yeah, it's I think, again, for folks that are not from the UK and that quite enjoyed the connectivity with the rest of Europe, less important stakeholders, but disappointed nevertheless that that's now actually real. Rupak, I wanted to actually now connect that with kind of your study of federations and of federalism. I mean, again, it's controversial to say this, but I think the UK's exit from the EU is a quite significant moment in terms of our broader understanding of how constituent units relate to each other and what are the sources disconnection. And again, I think for me, sitting here in Pakistan, it's particularly important given the peace process that's ongoing in Afghanistan and the debate within Afghanistan about a unitary Afghanistan or a devolved Afghanistan, but also the wider conversation about regional connectivity. I think it's probably too late for India and Pakistan, at least right now, in terms of a wider regional approach. But even like looking north and west, how are states and countries supposed to come together when so many of the pressure points and vectors are in the opposite direction? We talked about executive agency, we talked about technology enabling kind of these kings and strong men to emerge. And we've seen, with Brexit, something that, a lot of us had taken for granted, that actually not only would the EU stay together and keep getting stronger, but that South Asia and so many other regions would assume a similar shape. ASEAN was supposed to be kind of the next EU, and the arguments and debates we used to have with our interlocutors on track 2s and track 1.5s in India was, let's focus on, some kind of a monetary union, a trade union, but something that brings us together. Now, all the political, sociological, economic forces seem to be ganged up in the opposite direction. How does that affect your job in terms of, in a sense, a stewardship role for federalism as an idea?
So, I'm not an expert on regional integration by any stretch, but I do want to pick up on an idea that Catherine was talking about in the context of the UK. Federalism is essentially about self-rule and shared rule. Self-rule for the constituent units, with having the autonomy to make decisions on key issues that they feel very strongly about. Often these are issues of identity, so right to have your own language, educate your population in whatever language, culture, socialize in whatever culture you feel is important. And the other aspect of that, of course, is shared rule, which is again, as Catherine was saying, and I think Pratap earlier, that you feel that you have a stake in the center. And the two reasons why countries have come together as federations is because of enhanced opportunities for national defense and greater economic integration. And countries who have gone from unitary to federal is to balance that unity and diversity and to manage identity. I think a very important aspect of this is ensuring what I would call a situation in the federation where all constituent units were treated equally, and by that, what I mean by that is that all constituent units have to be seen to be benefiting equally from being part of this. And this doesn't, even though Canada is a wealthy country, there are other federations who are new federations, but have been able to use the federal system to develop previously marginal parts of the country. And one country I have in mind now, and it's not a there is a question of democracy deficit. It's recently had a small civil war, but by and large, I'm talking here about Ethiopia. By and large, Ethiopians see the last 20 years as being part of a federal Ethiopia as being a net positive, because you've had a federal government that has tried to develop uniformly most of the country, and that's been represented in very high growth rates, high levels of literacy, all those sorts of things. So I think it's about giving for us as we go about working with countries to establish federal or devolved system, it's about ensuring that all parts feel represented and included in whatever the national project is, however that's shaped.
As I said earlier, we could go on for quite a while, but I believe we're approaching time today, Pratap. I guess I just want to go back to this idea that with technology, this notion that Rupak mentioned about intimacy with the people, this should have been something that fueled a sense of inclusion and ownership. And it should, in fact, instead of causing alienation, it should cause a sense of participation. But I guess it's multifarious, the impact of technology, is it not?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, sometimes it feels like, we are probably like in an era that was probably characteristics in the aftermath of the discovery of printing, right? Which is there are all kinds of new information orders being unleashed whose logic and dynamics we don't fully understand yet. I mean, it has empowered billions of people literally together. How does one establish authority in this? So I do think on this, we are probably in a kind of, I think, a protracted period of churn. But I do want to pick on something you said, given this panel, I think it's worth reiterating that, look, fundamentally, and particularly in our South Asian context, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, I think any kind of regional thinking about federalism and federation will require a normative consensus on three things, right? And that is what's eluded us, right? One is a commitment by states to the pacification of violence and not the use of violence as an instrument. The second, I think, is a shift away from thinking of fixed identities to a commitment to individual freedom. In fact, the stronger, that there has to be a normative consensus underlying, right? It's not just about power sharing. Because I think, the identities is important and need to be protected. But identities have also become a trap for all of us. And so if we can move from identity to freedom, all kinds of identities will flourish anyway, right? I mean, and the third
but also the idea of multiple identity.
Exactly, multiple, changing.
Be more than one thing, yeah.
Exactly, and the third is, I think, we have to get our priorities right on saying, look, the economic well-being of our citizens is of paramount importance, and the opportunity cost of not thinking of trade and all of those things, and subordinating them to various kinds of identity issues. Because if you have a consensus on these three things, everything else can be worked out. I mean, those are, I think we are not confronting the elephant in the room, which is a consensus on these values in the first instance.
Perhaps we're not confronting them because we don't want to bring people down, Pratap. I got to be honest with you. I'm a relentless and shameless, I would say, optimist, as I think, as you know, and but particularly on regional issues, I've kind of thrown in the towel, frankly, and I really admire anyone that thinks otherwise. Maybe that's a good note for us to ask for kind of closing sort of thoughts or remarks. Catherine, is it wrong to be this negative about the hopes for normative consensus? Forget about across countries and in the region. I find normative consensus in small towns and villages difficult to arrive at, especially when we see images of the kinds that we've seen from all of the countries that we have lived in, have loved, have called our own, or not otherwise. This is not. There's a human dimension to all this. There's no monopoly on the kind of dysfunction of representation and the absence of these norms.
Absolutely. And coming back to technology, I mean, people are now being empowered not only to kind of have access to other views that wouldn't have been in the mainstream before, but it's also difficult sometimes to know how much support these ideas have, because, someone can be very successfully amplifying something, divergent opinion. And, it's very difficult to know whether it's actually got a lot of support behind it. I mean, if I could just end on talking about, Pakistan, I think, huge changes were made with the 18th Amendment, in terms of people coming together, reaching agreement. And it was a real milestone in the history of Pakistan. And I would like to see that continue. And I'm slightly worried by demands to roll back, even though there are fiscal imperatives behind it. But the other thing I would say is that, accommodation, India, the Indian example is a great one. You talked about creating new states. India's, obviously just got rid of a state in Kashmir. But it's been a lot more successful at accommodating its diversity because it has created these new states. And constantly, whether it's the PPP, the PMLN, or the PTI, there's been this commitment to create this southern Punjab province, whether it's a Saraiki state or Bhopal, you know, but nothing ever happens. And, you know, that's something that I think, you know, Pakistan could learn from its neighbour and would actually benefit federal centre-province relations.
I think that's a great note to kind of end on, and maybe to take it to you, Rupak, for your thoughts. I guess, you know, I keep putting you on the spot here in terms of, you know, learning and juxtaposition and cross-functionality. I guess Pakistan would love to learn how to make more provinces and be more functional, but would not want to adopt the majoritarianism that has evolved in India, and that, you know, I think now really challenges any ideas of a functional diversity in India in the way that we used to understand it even 10 or 15 years ago. Is that just a good cautionary tale that there are no perfect suits and we all have to bespoke our own and learn the hard way?
Well, I think you can be inspired by positive as well as negative examples from around the region, but I think you have to you have to earn your own. As somebody who works in governance, you rarely see things change over short periods of time, and I tend to take a very long view of this. Of course, Keynes said in the long term we're all dead, but nevertheless, I find it reassuring whenever I work in the area of governance reform or democracy building, that it took 700 years from the Magna Carta to women getting the vote, with lots of reversals in between. So I think we will eventually get there. In that sense, I'm an optimist, but it is a long haul. It requires commitment. It requires political commitment, because ultimately, you know, this consensus building on issues of governance is a very highly political, process, and in many countries, including in India, where I've worked in the past, looking at issues of constitutional reform are often left to technocrats, and that's not the way to do it. I mean, yes, you need a technical committee to look at these issues, but it's the politicians who have to sit down and tackle these sorts of issues.
Pratap, you get the last word. Optimist or realist? I don't think it's being pessimistic to say that we don't have 700 years for this region.
Look, you know, our own histories, recent histories are extraordinary. It's amazing when we set our minds to something, what we can do. So I, in that sense, I remain an optimist. I mean, I think, you know, Pakistan, obviously, for quite a while, India more recently, we've had our setbacks. But, you know, I think it's important to see this more as a moment of churn. There will be the inevitable pushback will come. I think our societies are too complex to be railroaded in the way that some people fear they will. And I think the one lesson we have to learn from right wings all over the world, right? I think that's one thing they've been more successful about, is they have a much more generative view of politics. It's all of us social scientists who became sociologically determinist. That if you actually do the hard work of, you know, literally going out, working hard, building organizations, all the stuff that the center and the left used to do at some point, the Congress party used to do, but forgot, you know, 25, 30 years ago, you can actually still bring out change. So politics will always give us an opening. And, you know, we need to keep pushing at this, you know, the region as a zone of freedom idea that we discussed many years ago. There's also generational change, which will give an opportunity, I think, at some point.
I think the bravest and strongest intellect is the one that clings to hope in the face of a lot of evidence that pushes us in the other direction. So I will use the optimism of Catherine, Rupak, and Pratap to reflect more on how we can make that happen. And I will expect, if you don't mind, all three of you to answer the call once again and many, many more times in the future. Thanks so much for doing this with us, Pratap, Rupak, Catherine. This was a phenomenal conversation, and one that I know I benefited from.